Adam, I mean, you're
Yeah,
always up first. What is your take on this topic today?
I always really like story-driven games. Typically, I mean, obviously, it's fun every now and then to play something that's just dumb fun. But yeah, I typically like the stories, which is why I play a lot of RPGs and don't play so many of the competitive multiplayer games as much. Just because, I mean, in competitive multiplayer, obviously, you want to keep the action going because you want people to be able to moving at the same pace. So if you have to stop for lore dumps and stuff like that, it's not going to work very well. So for me, that's part of the reason why I typically play single player games. And yeah, RPGs are typically the best for that. So and I typically like things that have a lot of deep lore in them, where you can go through and learn about the history of the world and things that you might not necessarily see, but you can, like, you come to a town and you can see the history of the town, or stuff like that. I typically like those kind of games that have really fleshed out worlds, kind of the Star Wars of games. You have each little town like a little planet, and you have species with their backgrounds and everything.
So, do you have an example of that, Adam?
uh okay, so I mean, obviously you could have, like, Final Fantasy is a big franchise. They have a lot of story driven. They don't typically have too much lore in the background, just because every single game is different. So, they'd have to rebuild an entire world from scratch every single time. But as far as background, one game that I always thought had a really interesting, like, kind of a background world to it was, and kind of an interesting story was, what was it called? Soul Sacrifice on the PlayStation Vita was really interesting to me, because what they did is, in that game, they have this world and you're following the story of a guy. Literally, you have a talking book, and the book is telling you the story of this guy. And he's on a journey with his friend, who is slowly becoming kind of corrupted by false memories. Because in that world, if a sorcerer is somebody who can use magic, but your magic is stored in your left arm, and so you can absorb the souls of monsters and other people into your left arm, and that's where your magic basically stems from, because you can get the powers of whatever it is that you've absorbed. But you absorb them wholesale. So then, you absorb their memories and such too. So over time, you can start to mix their memories with your memories. So, like, for example, at one time he's talking about how his friend wanted to go see his family. So they went on this long journey to go visit his friend's family. And when they get to the house, everybody's dead and whatnot. But then nobody in the town recognizes his friend. And it turns out that actually what had happened was his friend had sacrificed another sorcerer who had become corrupted, and that sorcerer had a family. And when he sacrificed that sorcerer and took on his memories, he thought it was his own family. And so slowly over time, this guy becomes more and more kind of corrupted by these memories and the emotions of monsters and whatnot. But then they also go into the lore of every single monster. So they have like a compendium. So if you defeat a monster, you can go into this the basically the appendix or whatever it is of this book, and it will tell you where the monster comes from, the story of it, and most of the monsters are inspired by fairy tales from our world. So they're like corrupted fairy tale kind of things. One of my favorites was one of the levels was Resplendent Rapunzel, I believe, and if in the level you just have these towering giant heads floating in the air on these long necks that are basically like tree trunks. And in the story, what it was there was a town, and in the town, bandits came by and would steal the daughters of the town. And at one point, they came and they killed all the men of the town. So the only thing that were left were the mothers. And they were so afraid of the bandits coming back that they made a wish that they could protect their daughters forever. And there's this chalice in the game that shows up when people get desperate, and it shows up. So they make a wish on it, and they all kind of grow their heads super large, and then their necks stretch out, and they kind of root themselves to the ground. And so their daughters kind of live in crowns on their heads, and then their hair grows super long so that the daughters can climb down, and they can retract their hair when the bandits come, so the daughters can climb back up. And it's really weird, but it's really rich and it's really interesting, and I really like things like that.
Is it only a PS Vita game, or can you find it anywhere? Each time you speak, seems to have some PS Vita games in your mind. So I feel that there's a lot of good games I missed.
There were so many good games on it. You can get them on if you have PlayStation TV, which was basically a Vita that you could plug into your TV. If you had that, you could get them, but currently, no, there's no other way to get them. So, one thing that they did say was with the new PlayStation thing, they said that you're getting the PlayStation 2, PlayStation 1 games, downloadable PlayStation 3 games, streaming. And they did mention PSP, but they didn't mention PS Vita. So, it's kind of up in the air as to whether some of these games will come out or not. So, I'm hoping they do so that more people can experience them because there were a lot of really great games on the Vita. But otherwise, yeah, they've never released it anywhere else, which is a shame. And also, a lot of these games, Soul Sacrifice, Freedom Wars, Gravity Rush, a lot of these games were released by Studio Japan, which is now defunct. It doesn't exist anymore. They disbanded it. So, yeah, I mean, they're all, I mean, was it Japan Studio, Studio Japan? I don't remember what it was called. I mean, it was Sony themselves. It was an in-house developer. So, they still have all the IP and everything. So they could do more with it, or they could re-release it if they wanted to. But I don't think there are any plans to right now.
Cool. It's a good thing I tagged this with Final Fantasy because I knew someone would bring Final Fantasy up at least once in this podcast today.
I was actually going to go straight for Soul Sacrifice, but I noticed you tagged Final Fantasy, and I was like, "Uh oh, I guess we're obligated to talk about it." So I was like, I don't want to not mention it. And then Korean has his tag up, so I was like, "Oh, I better bring it up just in case."
Oh, okay. I thought it was just going to be brought up automatically.
No, I wasn't going to until I saw the tag. That's why I kind of glossed over it and went straight to Soul Sacrifice.
All right. Antoine, what about you? What's your take on your topic?
Well, typically, no, I'm gonna fluff out about what Adam said. I really agree on the fact that I love story-driven game with a lot of lore behind, and we talked recently a lot about Horizon Zero Dawn or Forbidden West. Typically, it's the kind of game that I saw a lot of people saying it's a boring game. Of course, if you don't like the story, it's boring. It's basically an exploration game, a lambda, a bit like everything else. But if you get interested in the story, that's a lot of fluff, a lot of lore that you can scan, and there's lots of side stories that you would, never hear or learn about if you don't take the time to read all of this text. And I can understand that maybe younger player like, oh my god, I have to read through all of that. I don't want to. So I can understand that it can be boring for some people, but I really like to have all uh, this fluff around. What I really like is when I play a game that the story is interesting. I want to feel that the universe it created, feels alive. And typically, when I think of the best game I've ever played, the first or one of the first which come in my mind would be Mass Effect, because Mass Effect is story driven on 3 games, four if you count Andromeda, soon to be 5. I really hope very soon, but I don't even know if they have a release date in mind at the moment. But the story of Mass Effect is fantastic from beginning to to the end. Well, that's agreeable at the end at least. But all 3 games are fantastic, and there's a big lore. Like each alien race has its own story that you learn through the games, and depending on your choice, maybe you will learn about it or not. Or I don't remember the race of uh, kind of warrior like uh, crocodile. I don't remember exactly what their name was, but you can choose to exterminate them or save them with a genophage. I found that fantastic because you are part of the story. So this is typically the kind of game that I really, really love. And maybe it's just because I'm not too young anymore, but I feel like when we were younger, there was a very big attention on the story because, well, the games were quite ugly, to be honest. Even if at the time we were like, wow, such a revolution. It's like three pixels together. So they had to make a very interesting story behind to keep you, keep you playing the game. At least for, well, Final Fantasy typically, because if you remember the first Final Fantasy, there was not even a background. The background was black in the first or maybe second and third one. I don't remember when they started including animation. There wasn't even animation on the characters. So, they just succeeded in making a great story, and that's why the games were great. And I really like this kind of games much more than the Assassin's Creed, which include historical figure, and somehow I can't get into it as much as I would in a completely fabricated fantasy game such as Mass Effect or Warhammer 40K or this kind of thing.
Very cool. So I think you guys know what is my expected answer. That it's like Antoine mentions, Mass Effect, and I enjoyed Mass Effect as well because I did like the story of 1 and 2 and 3, and I do remember not pressing the space bar very quickly as the dialogue was going, like very often. It's not like I was playing Dragon Quest Builders and there is some story in it. And I do find myself after like the first dialogue box just hitting B B B B B B B, so I can just skip it, just like tell me what to do. But like lore and stuff, I remember playing Skyrim, 11 years ago or 12 years ago, and thinking, actually looking at some of the books and some of the story, and I guess it's as I've gotten older and stuff, I've always felt like there is a countdown on my gaming time. So Jesus Christ, yeah. Even when I was a kid, I had this restriction of when I was growing up. My mom was like, "Okay, Saturday or Sunday you can play games for an hour." So that's it. And even as an adult, right, and not having lived in my house since I was 17, I still sort of I've never played games for longer than an hour and a half. I never even played games for 2 hours in a stretch. So that's why I always feel lore and story or background stuff in games is always just stopping me from enjoying stuff because I get my story from books or games. I shouldn't say games, books or TV shows usually because I do watch. Well, I watch less TV now, so I find like games is just for playing and doing stuff and making choices and killing stuff if it's an FPS or you know turtling if it's a RTS game or playing cards and totally steamrolling someone if it's Hearthstone, or just sort of like games are for doing and books and TV are for sort of passively absorbing a story. So I've never like I enjoyed the first Assassin's Creed when it came to history and story, but then again I never felt like I believe like some games they where lore or story is optional is better for my kind of personality or playing style, but where stories like in Dragon Quest or other games where you have to get through the story, right, or you have to do this cutscene and you can't skip it, I really hate that now. Sometimes the stuff is actually really really interesting, but other times it's just like I feel like I don't think in 2022 or in the future anything should be forced on the player, because if the player doesn't want to listen to your story, fine, let's just let them play. They already paid the $60 or $70 or $20, whatever the price is for their game, and if they don't want to enjoy it, that's their choice.